like to welcome you all to the Frontier Culture Museum for our final lecture of 2022. My name is David Puckett, Curator of Collections here at the museum, and our guest speaker tonight is Scott Hamilton Suter, Professor of English and American Studies and Director of the Margaret Grattan Weaver Institute for Regional Culture at Bridgewater College. Dr. Suter received his PhD in American Civilization from the George Washington University in 1994, where his research focused on American folklife and material culture studies. In addition to his 20 years at Bridgewater College, he has also worked in the museum world and as a public sector folklorist. He has published books, exhibition catalogs, journal articles, and book chapters on topics ranging from Southern literature to World War I humor, to David Lynch, to material culture studies and folk art. In 1999, the University Press of Mississippi published his Shenandoah Valley Folklife, an introduction to the traditions of the region, and the University of Tennessee Press published his most recent book, A Potter's Progress, Emanuel Suter and the Business of Craft in 2020. So I'll hand it over to Dr. Suter.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for coming. Can you hear me still? Okay, good, good. Yeah, so this is a project I've been working on for years, and I finally got tired of working on it and said I'm just going to publish what I have. And it came out to this surprisingly small book, unfortunately, but there it is. But what I want to do today is talk about most of the topic of this book, which is pottery, but not only pottery. But I also want to bring in some other aspects of Shenandoah Valley pottery world too. I feel like many of us who study these things have covered, say, the mid-19th century to the end. And so I'm going to talk about that. Emanuel Suter was in that mid-period up till the end. And then I'll talk a little bit about another company that was at the end as well. But recently, we have made, when I say we, friends of mine have made discoveries of much earlier pottery in Rockingham County in the eastern part. And so I acknowledge Chuck Lamb sitting all the way in the back. He's one of the people who's been spearheading this project, finding all kinds of artifacts that are tremendously exciting to me, and I'm guessing eventually to a lot of other people. So I want to talk briefly about that at the end, but try and give you a perspective on the 19th century. Anyway, so one thing that happens to me when I start talking about this, because look, these are my notes, I'll just talk. So I got to really try and keep myself calmed down here. Emanuel Suter, let's see, there's this book which I really recommend. Emanuel Suter, these are two images, what we believe to be a kind of wedding photo on the left, and a more formal portrait that was taken in 1895 there on the right. You may have noticed the connection between Suter and my name and in his name. He was my great-great-grandfather. And I know of at least one other descendant in the room today as well. So, and possibly others. People I don't know. But that's not why I wrote the book and why I did the research. I did the research because, as David noted, I'm interested in folklife and material culture, and Emanuel Suter left a lot of pots and a lot of records. He kept a diary every day for 35 years until shortly before he died, like days before he died. He kept business papers, all sorts of things, and they were stored in the attic of the house and then eventually taken to Eastern Mennonite University, and they're now in the archives of the Virginia Mennonite Conference. So you can go and look at all that stuff. But it was just such a treasure trove, and no one aside from the family historian from the 1950s, his granddaughter had even looked at this stuff. And so it was a real treat for me. And as I said, 25 or so years later, here comes a book. The one thing that really stood out to me and became the sort of drive behind my study of Emanuel Suter was this quotation from 1893. He often, at the end of every day, would write some sort of spiritual passage there. He and his wife were members of the Mennonite church, and it was something that was very important to him. But this really stood out to me. May we realize the importance of making progress in everything we have before us, let it be secular or spiritual. And in this book, this is kind of what I do. Try to bring this idea of progress out, primarily in the pottery works, but also in other aspects of his life, to show that he wasn't just like focused entirely on that. I do want to say that, this is my interpretation of Emanuel Suter's life. Someone else could come along, and I hope they do, and say, no, you're wrong there, and they write another book. It would be great, and there's a lot of material to do it. So I try to be very accurate, and most everything that's in here and what I'll talk about are facts. Some of it is my opinion. Okay, so I'm just going to go quickly over some of his ideas of progress. This is the homestead that Emanuel Suter received when he married Elizabeth Swope in 1855. It has, let me see, I've got some facts here. 140-acre farm, 7-acre orchard, raised cattle, pigs, sheep, and this is also where he started his pottery works, probably shortly after 1855. This is probably a late 19th century image. So I mentioned they were Mennonites. He was known as a reformer in the Mennonite church. The Mennonite church at that time chose ministers by the lot, which meant the congregation would nominate people who they thought would be a good minister in the congregation, and say 5 people, men. And someone would put a slip of paper with a Bible verse, which I can't remember, in one of the Bibles. And then the men would all come up and each pick a Bible. And whoever got the one with the slip of paper in was the minister, right? Now, Emanuel Suter was up, 3 or 4 times, and he never got it. But he really felt called to be a minister. And so he set about trying to change people's minds on this. And I don't have his side of the correspondence, but I have letters, or the archive has letters from Jacob Hildebrand, I think, who actually was from here in Augusta County. He was the bishop in the church, and you could tell that they were having this correspondence that was discussing it. It didn't happen in Emanuel Suter's lifetime, but eventually they did change that. He was also aimed to be up to date in agriculture. He did all kinds of things, steam power. Eventually, he added to his pottery. He, along with his brother, he purchased and operated a threshing machine throughout the neighborhoods. He became the agent for a reaper company in the 1860s and 70s from Lancaster. He experimented with grafting apple trees. He visited the world fairs in 1876 and 1893 to learn more about machinery. Machinery was the thing he was really interested in. Here are the things that he did. And also, he was progressive in his domestic space. And so you can see here, this image looks like a frame house, right? But actually, this part right here is a log house. And architectural historians will know that it was a log house, as we call it, right? And this was the back of the house, and this was the front. So 1874, he decided he had a lot of kids, and he needed some more room, so he completely redid the house and made the back here the front, and then he built this L addition onto the back. And what that did was give him some more space up here. This would have been the kitchen originally, and the hearth, the big open hearth, is still there. But he made it sort of a sitting room, and then there was also a parlor. And in that room until, I don't know how long ago now, 15, 20 years, when this house was renovated once again, there were rings in the ceiling, and that was so that the women could have their quilting racks there, and then when they needed the space, they would just pull the ropes that they had and go up to the ceiling, right? It was very clever. I also wanted to mention when he was seeking reform in the Mennonite church, he was also instrumental in starting Sunday schools in the church. Again, there was opposition to that because more conservative members felt that it would lead other religions into the mix, and that people who didn't really know the Bible would be teaching the Bible to young people and stuff. But he did get that passed through, and he was invited at one point to Western Pennsylvania, Scottsdale, where there were a lot of Mennonites as well, to give a lecture on how to be a good Sunday school superintendent. So he was also on the school board in the county. He did all kinds of stuff. He and his son, this is not even in the book because I forgot, he and one of his sons, John, started a post office on their farm, right? So if you look at some really old maps in the 1890s, you'll see Suters on the map, and that's where they lived. Okay, pottery. This John Heatwell here on the right was a slightly older cousin to Emanuel Suter, and he was a potter. And Emanuel Suter, we don't know too much. Emanuel Suter learned from him. We do know that. This sort of chart, which you probably can't really read from where you're sitting, is from an exhibit catalog that Jeff Evans and I did back in 2004. And it shows what, at the time, we thought of as a kind of family tree of potters in Rockingham County. And so it goes back to Andrew Kaufman, and his sons were potters, and two of his daughters married potters, Lindsay Morris and John Heatwell. And then, another son comes around, and Isaac Good fits in here, who was a neighbor of Emanuel Suter. And so there's just this whole network, right? And that was what initially attracted me to this idea. Was like, okay, I'm a folklorist. I'm going to look at these traditions, right? And so this is what I found. People learning in the traditional way. You go and learn from a neighbor or a family member how to do this craft. And thinking back to that quotation from Emanuel Suter, you can start to see as I looked at his career that he wanted to keep going, wanted to build on this, right? Not just be like, okay, it's not farming season, so I'll make pots. He wanted to make pots and keep making them. So, but here you can see a kind of the interconnections. That's why I wanted to put this up. Here are some examples of the material culture, right? So this piece that says J.D. Heatwell was made by J.D. Heatwell. This piece in the middle was made by John Heatwell. And this piece is marked Emanuel Suter. And you can just see the connection, right? Like who learned, he learned from him, right? How to make this form. The same is true here. This piece is John Heatwell. This is pieces on the other side marked Emanuel Suter, and this one is also Emanuel Suter, 1851. That's very early. That might be the earliest piece known that he made. But you see the connections, the big fat rims, the forms, all connect him to his master, if you will. Now, oh, I'm doing good. I'm already on page 2. So, this thing called the Civil War happened, and being Mennonites, the Suters were not too excited about joining the Confederacy. And many of the Mennonites would do various things to stay out, and what Emanuel Suter did was, initially, you could put in a substitute. And so he got another guy who said, yeah, I'll go for you. So he went in, but he felt guilty about this. And so he saved up money. You had to pay $500. That was in, the 1860s, $500 to be exempt. And so he did that. And then that meant that his substitute could come out, right? So that's the kind of pacifist he was. He was really was. So when the burning was taking place here, Sheridan, was going north, and he said, any of you who want to follow me can go along, take the oath of allegiance, and you can come with me out of the Confederacy and then go wherever you want when you're up there. And so Emanuel Suter took his family, and they went to Pennsylvania. And this was the point when he started to keep a diary, October of 1864. And so he did that. Went up there and was doing all kinds of work that he could find to try and make money. And they were in Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania, which is not too far from Harrisburg. And at one point he says, I took the train to Harrisburg to see the potter Wilcox about a job. And he did. The pottery in Harrisburg was Cowden and Wilcox. And it was a big pottery. And so people did different things, like Emanuel Suter knows how to dig the clay, mix the clay, make it into balls, make pots, fire them, glaze them, whatever needs to be done. He does it all. Here, people did different things. And he worked there from, let me see, I want to make sure I get it right. From January to April of 1865, he worked at Cowden and Wilcox. And he talks about things like bluing ware, which I assume means, painting the cobalt on there. He talks about setting the kiln. He talks about repairing the kiln. And he just really got, I think, excited. This is where I'm speculating. This is my argument. He got really excited about this because when he came back to the Valley in 1865, he notes that he started making pottery, but we don't know anything about what kind of a pottery he had on the farm at that time. But what he also did was start building a new pottery, and this is what he built. This is the New Erection pottery. It's called New Erection because there's a church in the neighborhood. It's now called Cooks Creek Presbyterian Church, but at the time it was called New Erection Church, and so that's how the community got its name. It's west of Harrisonburg. So he built this. This photo is, as I say, there probably 1885. Imagine it in 1865 or early 66. This was where he worked in Harrisburg, and the thing that I found particularly intriguing, in addition to the things that he talked about wanting to do, like he had learned in Pennsylvania, is that he built a kiln that looks pretty much just like this. And I don't know how much you know about pottery kilns. Usually they're round, right? And now we've got two of these examples of this, what I call a trapezoidal sort of figure. But, it's almost as if this could have been drawn from this, right? So I see that as a real material connection that's not only going on in his mind, but on the landscape and in his actions as well. So he had this up and he kept it working. Eventually, year-round, he hired workers. I'll talk about that in a minute. And kept that pottery shop going until 1891. and I'll talk more about that in a moment. Just a few examples. Oh, yeah, new ideas that he had at New Erection. He made a glazing machine. He talks about going to one of the local blacksmiths and getting him to make a nozzle for his glazing machine. And I talk a little bit about the importance of him using that word, machine, right? It's not like a glazing pump or whatever else it might be. It was a machine. That's the phrase he used. That was 1866, right after he opened that new place. 1878, he developed a tile press. And for many years, I always assumed a tile was, like a decorative arts and crafts period tile that people put around fireplaces and stuff. But it's actually more or less pipe, right? It's called drain tile. And he was turning drain tile. So you can imagine, like pulling up a pipe and then setting it aside, and it's just a piece of pipe, right? And he had this idea, and I don't know where he got it. I'm sure he didn't make it up, but he said, I'm going to make a tile press. So again, he draws up a tile press, and he takes it to the blacksmith, and he says, I need this. And he comes back with a tile press eventually. I'll show you some examples of where from that. 1884, he had steam power to the pottery. Here's a blow up of a portion of that photo. Let me see how quickly I can go back to that. Yeah, so this detail is this portion right here. And you can see that this is a flywheel, right? And so he had the engine in the pottery. It was turning the wheels. It was grinding the clay. But he also used it to saw up wood and stuff. And in the image, I won't go back again, but over here on the other side, you can see these piles of lumber that he had sawed. So it's, I'm sure that just happened to be what was there the day they were taking the photo, but it worked out really cool for me. Okay, here's some drain tiles, some sherds and two complete pieces. And these, you see these ridges and things here. This is evidence of the tile press, right? Because he would put it on there, and have a rammer or something that shoved it through, and you can see how it would leave these kinds of marks. And these were all in the ground, I'm pretty sure, at one point in their lives. So, again,
tiles glazed?
no,
They were
just plain clay tiles, yeah. This is just a letterhead from 1884 where he's, at this point, signing himself as E. Suter and Son. His oldest son, named Reuben, started to work with him by that time, and he was advertising himself as a manufacturer of all kinds of earthenware. And this is important in the discussion of 19th century Valley pottery because the sort of apocryphal legend is that people stopped making earthenware because of the lead glaze, and people knew it was not good for you, and they didn't want that anymore. Well, here in 1884, he's advertising himself as an earthenware manufacturer. He also made stoneware, but he focused on earthenware, and that's pretty late, according to those arguments. Here's some examples of his common forms. You see a 1.5 gallon, a 1 gallon, a 1/4 gallon, and a 1/2 gallon, which those two look remarkably the same in size, but they had probably some of the younger sons would have made clay balls for the potters who were turning, and they would weigh it and say, okay, we need this much to make this size, right? And so sometimes they just didn't get the right size on there. But again, you can see here, some are glazed inside and out. These are glazed inside and out. This one on the inside only, and this one on the inside only. And he sold them at different prices, single glaze or double glazed, he called it. These are just some jars. This one in the middle is attributed to Isaac Good, but these two both descended in the Suter family, and so it's pretty clear they came from there. Just here's an aside. I love this kind of stuff on these pottery pieces because those are the fingerprints of the potter, you know? I think that's so cool. Sometimes if I'm writing about this, I'll sit there and I'll look at it and try and get inspiration. But don't think I'm that strange. Here's flower pots. Now, flower pots was one of his big items in the 1870s, 1880s. I was talking to someone earlier who was, she's a graduate of Mary Baldwin. One of the things that he did was make, I forget, hundreds of these, I keep pushing the wrong button, hundreds of these things, which he called nourishers. They're very small. Every one of these pieces has a hole in the bottom, right? So, because it's flower pot. But he made many, many of those for Mary Baldwin. I don't know what they used them for, but they did that. But these are all examples of flower pots, mostly earthenware. Again, you see some fingerprints here. This I just threw in. This is the only known example of molded ware made by Emanuel Suter. Now, one of his sons, David Irenaeus, made some molded ware later. But this is made in two pieces. There were two of these that he made to put on the front porch. And this is the only one that survived. It's stamped on there, E. Suter, Rockingham, Virginia, I think. He didn't have a very good time with that. He was complaining about that in the diary. I'm just going to take a minute here because I wanted to read you something about flower pots. Let's see. Let me get you this. So he had an order, 1886. He got a request for 20,000 flower pots from Stanton Merchants, Freiber, and Coiner. Maybe some of you are familiar with them. I've not been able to really track them down. So in March of that year, he built a new kiln, a small kiln to burn flower pots in. So he's making flower pots like crazy. Now you couldn't make all of these at once. But he just kept going and going and going. He turned pots on Monday through Saturday for nearly 3 weeks. But he also hired people to help him. So he enlisted, I'm going to read here now, enlisted the help of family members and other potters from the area, along with his sons, Reuben, Perry, Swope, Emanuel Jacob, and D.I. Suter also relied on the skills of John D. Heatwell, so his teacher, and Isaac Good. Good had already been turning at the pottery, and his accounts demonstrate the type and number of pots that he turned. The chart lists the pots turned by size, measuring them in inches. Since flower pots were the only type of ware that Suter sold by this measurement, it's clear that Good turned flower pots for Suter throughout the year. An examination of this detailed record demonstrates that in the month of September, Isaac Good turned primarily 2-inch pots. From September 9th through October 2nd, he turned 8,575 2-inch flower pots, achieving his highest total on the 11th when he completed 571 pieces. Moreover, on Monday, following this month-long spurt of 2-inch pots, Good began to turn the 3-inch size. So from October 4th through the 19th, he produced 5,154 flower pots of that size. In other words, he had turned 13,729 of the 20,000 needed to fill the bill. The potters typically worked a standard 10-hour day, but in order to complete such a large order, Suter expanded his hours and allowed Good to work a night shift. So he worked all day, got something to eat, and went back to work. During this period, Good worked 2.5 hours each evening, earning an additional 25 cents on top of his $1 a day wage. I just think that's a phenomenal effort that deserves to be recognized. And they made the bill. They sold them 20,000 pots, and everybody was happy. So I just wanted to get that in and for the sake of Isaac Good. So here's some examples of Emanuel Suter's stoneware. You can see, if you're familiar with decorated stoneware, you know it's often very beautiful and elaborate and things. He was more interested in turning pots. And so he didn't do a lot of decoration. Most of his ware doesn't have decoration, but some does. He did a chicken here. This is a very typical sort of flower here. Then this kind of minimalist stuff shows up a lot. Here are a couple other pieces. You can see, okay, I can make some petals and a flower coming out the top, and then I'm done, right? John Heatwell, on the other hand, was elaborate. He was making like palm trees and stuff on his pots. This is just a couple of examples of some banks that Emanuel Suter made for local churches, for the kids to save money in for missionary work, and then they'd crack them open and take the money out. Okay, quickly, laborers at New Erection. Okay, these are the people that I've identified through the records and things. So he had unskilled laborers: Jeremiah Falls, Joseph Gaines, James Ford. They would do things like help dig clay, chop wood for the kiln, grind clay, but they weren't making pots, and they were doing farm work and stuff like that. The potters included, as you heard, John D. Heatwell occasionally, Jacob Suter, who was Emanuel Suter's younger brother, also could make pots and did early on in the 1860s and early 1870s. Joseph Silver was a guy that Emanuel Suter met at Cowden and Wilcox. He was a German immigrant who was working at Cowden and Wilcox, and eventually Emanuel Suter invites him to come down to Rockingham County, where he comes. He marries a local woman, and he at various times tried to run his own pottery, and eventually it failed, and he died from stomach cancer, and his wife tried to keep the pottery going, and his kids were potters, but it never really worked out. Isaac Good, I mentioned. Charles Binsfeld, who, according to Emanuel Suter, was a Prussian. He came early in the 1860s, the late 1860s, and worked on molded ware. He was making spittoons at that New Erection pottery, but he wasn't there for very long. And then John Ford is another person who was a brother to James Ford, but John Ford could turn pots as well. And so this is the family portrait from 1895, and you can see that the Suters had 8 sons, and each one of them worked in the pottery in some capacity. Some of them turned ware, some of them turned ware and did other stuff. Charles here was the youngest. I think he was, like carrying pots up to the loft after they'd been glazed and stuff like that, So every one of them. And there are pieces, I pointed out the handprints. There are pieces that I've seen that have these really little hands on, and you can tell a kid picked it up while it was still wet and set it aside. It's really cool. Okay, so I said that he moved in 1890. He tore his pottery down 1891, actually. Harrisonburg was undergoing a boom, and this company, Harrisonburg Land and Improvement Company, bought all of this property, and this is their map. This is Harrisonburg down here, Court Square, maybe here. So this is the town, and then this is sort of coming out north of town, and then this is all residential lots, and the railroad was there by that time, and so they had industrial lots put along here that they were touting. They were going to have a Jones and Laughlin steel mill was going to come, and they did have some industries, a shoe factory, a shovel factory, but they never really flew. And two of the other industries were Emanuel Suter's pottery right here. It was called Harrisonburg Steam Pottery. And down here was another pottery, which I'll talk about in a few moments. And so Emanuel Suter says, I'm going to incorporate my business. I'm going to sell stock. I'm going to have stockholders, and I'm going to be making pottery that I can sell everywhere. And he originally took a trip west because at that time the cutting edge potteries were in Ohio, but they were also making ware up in New Jersey. So he traveled to Ohio and studied stuff, and he went to New Jersey and studied stuff. He ends up ordering clay from New Jersey. He's getting coal because you have to fire with coal, and he's getting that from Pennsylvania, and all this has to be shipped in, and then all of this. And you can read all about this in the book, but it didn't work, is basically the gist of it. But he tried it for 7 years, and then he sold the business. So here's a piece of stock, right? Harrisonburg Steam Pottery Company, E. Suter, president. And there's really cool stuff in the book where I'm quoting his diary, where you can get a sense of, he would go in there and say, oh, I went in to turn some pots today, but somebody else was turning pots, so I didn't get to, and stuff like that, because he was doing all the presidential stuff. And there's some really good details about his trips. He talks about, he went to A.P. Donahoe in West Virginia. If you're familiar with pottery, you've probably seen those stenciled things, and he's like, that's old stuff, they're using horses. But he wanted to go to Ohio, right? And he went to Roseville and various other places. And look, this is what he saw there. These big bottle kilns, big old manufactories, train line. Yeah, that's what he wanted, right? And he got very infatuated with what's called a jigger wheel, which I'll show you in a moment in case you don't know what that is. So he comes back, and this is a patent drawing by this kiln builder, John Hawthorne. This is a patent from 1894 in which he had this idea of injecting steam into the kiln, which, and again, this is not fact, this is my opinion. I think that he was working on that idea when Emanuel Suter opens up the Harrisonburg Steam Pottery. Yes, he had steam power, but he'd had that for years, right? And that's not a novelty anymore. Now we're talking about steam in the process. That's just my theory, okay? So John Hawthorne built the kiln at the Harrisonburg Steam Pottery. Now, unfortunately, there's no image of the Harrisonburg Steam Pottery that we know of yet. If you know of one, let us know. But this is the other pottery I mentioned and showed you on the map. And it opened in 1890. John Hawthorne built that kiln, so you can get a pretty good idea. That's what the one at the steam pottery looked like. This pottery has a very interesting story as well, which I'll talk about in a minute if I have time. Here's just a billhead that says, look, he's making stoneware now. He doesn't make any earthenware at the steam pottery because that's not what people were making then. He made jugs, he made stove flues, etc. And I just put a slide of stove flues in here. The one on the left is from New Erection, all right? And this one is from Harrisonburg Steam Pottery. This one on the left, earthenware. This one's stoneware. Of course, they don't have bottoms, right? Because they were like, you stick them in the wall and put the stovepipe in. That's what those were for. Okay, so here's a guy turning ware on a kick wheel, right? We think about somebody making pots by hand, that's what we think of. Here's what a jigger wheel does. You get a form, and you stick it on the wheel, and you get the wheel spinning, you put some clay on there, and you just pull this thing down, and you've made a pot. So you see, there's very little skill involved. Now, I mean, I'm sure it's difficult, but it's not like trying to turn a piece of pottery. I don't know if any of you have ever tried to do that, but it's not easy. It became clear to me early on that my skill was not in the pottery business. So here's some examples. These all descended in the Suter, with members of the Suter family, of Harrisonburg steam pottery that shows the jiggering process. You can see here, this was just like a 1-gallon jar, and then they also jiggered a top, and jug top, and then they stuck it on there. This has a very pronounced rim and thing here that obviously was jiggered. This has, when you look at it, you can see on the lip that it also was made on a jigger wheel. So this was an advancement again, right? That people were using in Ohio, and so that's what we needed to use too. But it just, for various reasons, it was too hard to import everything and then make money to ship it out. There was a depression that came, and he just said, in fact, he said, I sold the pottery today for $2,000. That relieves me of further trouble with that works, you know. And that was all he ever said. These are also examples that are not jiggered, but because they were also turning ware still at Harrisonburg Steam Pottery. And you can see he was using different slips and things like that. And the pots themselves just aren't nearly as attractive, really. So here's something from New Erection, some stoneware, and here's what he was making when he tried to be an industrial potter. Okay, this is where I want to switch. That was Emanuel Suter. Now I'm going to switch to this pottery, which has an incredibly interesting story, which I could also talk about for 40 minutes, but I'm not going to. But I put a reference at the end in case you want to look up the story, because it is fascinating. This was part of the boom, and a guy from New Jersey came down. He was originally from Staffordshire, England. He came, said he could start this pottery, so he did. The land company invested and built it and everything, and he operated and had lots of employees and did all sorts of things, but it just, eventually he died a couple years afterwards. And he's just a fascinating guy. Like at one point he like pulls a pistol on someone, you know, that was arguing with him and things like that. So this was called the Rockingham pottery, then it became the Virginia pottery. I'm going to get the chronology wrong here. Then it was the Old Dominion pottery, then it was Massanetta art pottery, then it was adamant porcelain, and then it burned down. That's it. Okay, this is some sherds glued together from that site. This is not from there, but I put it there to show you an example of what they were doing, right? So they were molding ware, and you know, they would have molded the top and then stuck it on there as well. It's a spittoon. They also were well known for making one of the ubiquitous Rebecca at the Well pots, teapots, right? They're made all over. This was their version. They made them in different sizes. There are a lot of pieces that I've picked up from out there. You can see here, these are handles and tops of lids and things like that I picked up. You see them kind of mixed in here. Keep these insulator electrical parts in mind, because that's what Adamant Porcelain was making at the ends, right? Here's part of their catalog, and you can see this is what they were doing. So about 1914, this happens. And when I published the article in 2019, I didn't know about these images, and I'm very sad because they're impressive. And I do want to say that they were found at Rocktown History in the archives. And they're very tiny. They're usually like this big. But this was adamant porcelain. It burned down. But you can see they never bothered repainting it from the Massanetta Art Pottery Company. and it burned, and you can see one of the kills. Eventually it had 2 kills. I think this is the outline of maybe the second one, and this one here. So that was literally the end of industrial pottery tradition, I would say, in the Shenandoah Valley, at least in Rockingham County that I know of. Now, I'm going to switch to the very exciting part I was talking about of new research that's being done. This is like, if you imagine a giant and then you imagine the size of my pinky fingernail, that's how much the comparison is to what this shows you and how much Chuck and Don Miller have picked up. I mean, they could fill this room, I think, right? Am I right, Chuck? Yeah. These are some of those early pieces I was telling you about. Very exciting. These are obviously jug spouts. Maybe not too exciting, but one of the things that excites people like me is this kind of ribbing that you see on the necks of the jugs. You don't see that in mid-century pots and later on. And look here, right? And a very rounded lip, just a completely different form. Here's an example of one piece of decorated ware. That's 2, and that cool thing on the right is a G, right? 2 gallons with fabulous stuff. There's many, many pieces with cobalt decoration, very elaborate cobalt decoration. And there's also a lot of these that tell us who made them, which is the really exciting part, because you don't have to wonder who made these things, right? William and J.S. Ricketts, Rockingham County, Virginia, right? Now, up until this point, as far as I know, people who study this stuff knew of one pot that was stamped Ricketts, and you couldn't really read it very well. It's not stamped very well. And I think we even thought maybe it said Andrews Ricketts or something like that, but there's one piece, right? And then all of a sudden, with careful deliberation, Chuck and Don are finding the spot where the broken pieces were thrown. Thousands of them, right? That's just going to be so much to learn. And I want to say just about how early this is. These are just a couple of notes that I have. So 1804, right? 1804. This is a quotation. On the deed books of Rockingham County, Captain Stephen Conrad was granted the right to take potter clay from the land of John Maggart, 1804. And if he was taking potter's clay, that means he had a pottery, right? 1804. 1807, Captain Conrad bought 1,000 acres from Asher Waterman, and under the terms of this contract, he was to pay Mr. Waterman in potter's ware. Right? So here, the great thing about this is the blending of material evidence with documentary evidence, right? That's the fun of it. One more thing here from 1825. There was a court case in the Chancery causes, and they're talking about this, and it says, okay, running with that line to within 1 pole of the Negroes' dwelling houses, thence at equal distance around said home and potter's kill back of the house to the front of the said kill, right? So documentary evidence, there's a kill there, right? Now we know of one that's there because there's parts of it still there. This is a later kill from mid to the end of the 19th century, but there's no remnants, and that's what these guys are finding, and it's really exciting stuff, and I'm excited to get to work with them on it. Yes?
Were these pieces that they found, where they just found lots of pieces there, were those just like reject brick that were, lots that were thrown
Yeah.
away? And then what are those little rings on the next to?
I think they were just stylistic, or some people would argue, then you could put a cloth over and tie a string, but that's what the lip of a jug does anyway. So I think it's just stylistic. Yeah. So that's my last slide. So you can ask me questions now. Thank you all for listening and not sleeping.
Thank you for watching this talk. If you share our passion for early American history and would like to support free programs like this, please consider making a donation to the American Frontier Culture Foundation at frontierculturefoundation.org. Thank you for your support, and we hope to see you in person at the Frontier Culture Museum in Stanton, Virginia.